The coffee cup shattered against the porch boards, dark liquid spreading like spilled blood across the weathered wood. Samuel Hartwell stood frozen, his weathered hand still extended where the cup had been, staring at the figure emerging from the morning mist that clung to his pasture like ghostly fingers. She moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to make herself small, her torn dress the color of dried earth, her bare feet leaving crimson prints in the dew-soaked grass. Dark hair hung in tangled curtains around a face that might have been beautiful once, before whatever had happened to her had happened. She clutched something against her chest, a bundle wrapped in what looked like the remnant of a blue shawl. Samuel had built this ranch on the edge of nowhere for a reason. 23 years since he'd last seen another soul cross his land uninvited. 23 years since Martha's fever had taken her, since he'd buried their hopes along with her small body behind the cottonwood grove. 23 years of silence broken only by cattle lowing and wind through the canyon walls. The woman stopped 30 paces from his porch, swaying like wheat in a summer storm. Her eyes, God, her eyes were the color of winter sky, found his across the distance. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Please," she whispered, and somehow he heard her clear as Sunday bells despite the space between them. "Please, let me stay." That's when Samuel noticed the bundle she held wasn't cloth at all. The blue fabric fell away as her strength failed, revealing a tiny face, perfect and still as carved ivory. A child, no more than a year old, with skin pale as moonlight and lips the faint blue of forget-me-nots. The woman's knees buckled. She caught herself, but barely, her free hand pressing against what Samuel now saw was a dark stain spreading across her ribs, soaking through the fabric like spilled wine. "I won't," she gasped, each word seeming to cost her. "I won't be trouble. Just until—" She never finished the sentence. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed forward, the child still clutched in her arms. Samuel was moving before he realized it, his boots pounding across the yard, but even as he ran, one terrible thought hammered through his mind like nails into a coffin. The child in her arms wasn't breathing. Samuel knelt in the dirt beside them, his calloused hands hovering over the woman's still form. Up close, he could see the full extent of her wounds, 3 deep gashes across her ribs, already festering, and older scars that spoke of violence as familiar as morning coffee. But it was the child that made his chest constrict like a fist around his heart. The boy, for it was a boy, Samuel could see now, had his mother's delicate features, but his skin held the waxy pallor of death. No breath stirred his tiny chest. No warmth radiated from his small body. Yet the woman held him as if he might wake at any moment, as if love alone could call him back from whatever darkness had claimed him. Samuel's rational mind screamed at him to walk away. To saddle his horse and ride to town, let Sheriff Morrison handle whatever tragedy had washed up on his land like driftwood after a storm. This woman was clearly running from something, or someone. The kind of trouble that followed desperate people into the wilderness didn't simply disappear with morning mist. But as he studied her face, something twisted deep in his chest. She couldn't be more than 25, still young enough to believe in happy endings. Young enough to hold a dead child and whisper prayers to an empty sky. Martha had been 23 when the fever took her. 23 and beautiful and full of dreams about the children they'd raise in this godforsaken valley. Samuel had held her the same way this woman held her boy, as if stubborn love could anchor a soul to a body that had already decided to leave. The woman's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with effort that seemed to drain what little strength remained in her. "Is he?" she began, then stopped, seeing the answer in Samuel's expression. "I'm sorry," he said, the words rough as sandpaper in his throat. She nodded once, a tiny movement that somehow contained all the grief in the world. 3 days now, she whispered. "I kept thinking, if I could just find somewhere safe. Who did this to you?" Her body went rigid at the question, her arms tightening around the dead child. "Please," she said again, and this time there was steel beneath the desperation. "I know how it looks. I know what you're thinking. But I swear to you I would never hurt him. He was sick, and I couldn't. I didn't have money for a doctor, And by the time I found one who would look at us. She was rambling now, fever-bright eyes searching his face for judgment, for condemnation. Samuel had seen enough desperate people to recognize the truth when he heard it. This woman was many things, broken, haunted, dangerous in the way that cornered animals were dangerous, but she wasn't a killer. The sound of hoofbeats drifted across the morning air, still distant but growing closer. The woman's entire body went taut as a bowstring, her head turning toward the sound with animal alertness. "They found me," she breathed, and the terror in her voice was so raw it made Samuel's stomach clench. "God help me, they found me." Samuel counted 6 riders cresting the ridge that bordered his eastern pasture, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky. Even at this distance, he could see the determined set of their shoulders, the way they sat their horses like men accustomed to hunting human prey. They moved with the coordinated precision of a pack, spreading out as they descended toward his ranch. "Who are they?" he asked, but the woman was already struggling to her feet, clutching the dead child against her chest with desperate strength. "Bounty hunters," she gasped, swaying dangerously. Fresh blood seeped through her dress where the movement had reopened her wounds. There's a price on my head. $500. $500. Samuel's mind reeled. That was more money than most men saw in 2 years, enough to make even honest folks consider betrayal. What crime could this slip of a woman have committed to warrant such a sum? "What did you do?" Her laugh was bitter as alkaline water. "I ran away from my husband." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Samuel had heard stories, of course, wealthy men in eastern cities who bought wives like they bought cattle, who considered their women property to be retrieved when they strayed. But to put a bounty on a woman's head for simply seeking freedom. "He owns half of Kansas City," she continued, her voice growing fainter as the riders drew closer. "Judges, marshals, politicians, they all danced to his tune. He told them I stole from him. That I murdered our child." Her arms tightened around the small body. "In a way, I suppose I did. If I'd been a better wife, a better mother." "Stop." Samuel's voice cut through her self-recrimination like a blade. "Grief makes liars of us all. But blaming yourself for a child's sickness won't bring him back." The bounty hunters were close enough now that Samuel could make out details: the glint of rifles across their saddles, the hard angles of faces accustomed to violence. Their leader, a man with silver threading his dark beard, raised his hand to halt the group just beyond rifle range. "Samuel Hartwell!" The man's voice carried clearly across the distance. "We're looking for a woman. Goes by the name of Eleanor Blackwood. We have reason to believe she might have sought shelter on your property." "Eleanor." Samuel glanced down at the woman, Eleanor, who had gone rigid at the sound of her name. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps, and he realized she was on the verge of collapse again. "She's a dangerous fugitive," the leader continued. "Wanted for theft and murder back in Kansas City. There's a substantial reward for her return, alive or dead." The casual way he spoke those last 3 words sent ice through Samuel's veins. These men didn't care about justice. They cared about collecting their blood money. And if Eleanor was right about her husband's reach, about the corruption that stretched its tentacles from Kansas City into the territories, then turning her over would be as good as signing her death warrant. Samuel looked down at Eleanor, at the way she held her dead child like a shield against the world's cruelty. Martha's face flickered in his memory, Martha, who had believed in the goodness of people right up until the fever claimed her. What would she have done? The bounty hunters were growing restless, their horses stamping and snorting. Samuel could feel their eyes on him, measuring, calculating. In a few moments, they would lose patience with diplomacy and simply ride down to search his property. And when they found Eleanor, "Please," she whispered one more time, the word barely a breath against the morning air. "I know I have no right to ask. But please." Samuel Hartwell had spent 23 years avoiding choices like this one. 23 years living quietly, keeping his head down, bothering no one and asking nothing in return. But as he looked into Eleanor's desperate eyes, he realized that some choices couldn't be avoided forever. The question was, what kind of man had he become in all those years of silence? "There's nobody here but me," Samuel called out, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Behind him, Eleanor had gone perfectly still, as if even breathing might give her away. The silver-bearded leader nudged his horse forward a few steps, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "You wouldn't mind if we took a look around then? Just to be thorough." "I would mind." Samuel let his hand drift toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail. "This is private property. You got no warrant, no authority here." A younger bounty hunter, his face marked by old smallpox scars, spat into the dirt. "We don't need authority to collect what's owed to us, old man." The leader raised a hand, silencing his companion. "Now, there's no call for hostility. We're all reasonable men here." His smile was cold as winter stars. "Tell you what, we'll offer you $100 just for information. If the woman passed through here, if you saw which way she went." "No questions asked?" $100. More money than Samuel made in 6 months of selling beef to the army garrison. Enough to fix his roof, buy supplies for the winter, maybe even hire some help for the spring roundup. All he had to do was point these men in the right direction and wash his hands of Eleanor Blackwood's troubles. "Haven't seen any woman," he said instead. The lie tasted bitter in his mouth, but something had shifted inside him the moment he'd made his choice. For the first time in 23 years, Samuel felt truly awake. Behind him, Eleanor made a sound that might have been a sob or a prayer. Samuel didn't turn around, didn't dare take his eyes off the mounted men, but he could feel her presence like warmth at his back. Could feel the weight of her trust, fragile and precious as spun glass. "See, that's interesting," the leader said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow managed to be more threatening than any shout. "Because we tracked her to your property line. Found blood on the rocks by your east pasture. Now either she sprouted wings and flew away, or someone's not being entirely truthful with us." Samuel's mouth went dry. He'd been so focused on Eleanor's condition that he hadn't thought about the trail she might have left. Of course these men would know how to track wounded prey. It was their livelihood. "Could be from a coyote," he said. "Or a deer. I don't examine every blood stain on my land." The scarred bounty hunter laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "You're protecting her. Got yourself a soft spot for pretty women, is that it? Well, let me tell you something about your houseguest, old man. She killed her own child. Smothered him in his sleep rather than let her husband raise him proper. What kind of woman does that make her?" The words hit Samuel like physical blows. He felt Eleanor flinch behind him, heard her sharp intake of breath. But he'd seen the way she held that child, seen the raw grief in her eyes. Whatever had happened in Kansas City, whatever lies her husband had spread to cover his own sins, Samuel knew evil when he saw it. And it was sitting on horseback 30 yards away, wearing badges and speaking of justice. "I think you boys should move along," Samuel said quietly. The leader's facade of politeness finally cracked. "We're going to search your property, Hartwell. You can step aside peacefully, or we can move you aside. But either way, we're taking what we came for." Samuel's hand closed around the rifle stock. 6 men against 1, but he had the advantage of cover and knew every inch of his land. More importantly, he had something these bounty hunters had never possessed, a reason to fight that went deeper than money. "You're welcome to try," he said. The morning air grew thick with tension, like the moments before a summer storm breaks. Samuel could hear Eleanor's labored breathing behind him, could smell the metallic scent of her blood and the sweeter, sadder smell of death that clung to the child in her arms. The bounty hunters spread out, hands drifting toward their weapons. Samuel raised his rifle, the familiar weight of it grounding him like a prayer. He thought of Martha, of the child they'd never had, of all the chances for goodness he'd let slip through his fingers over the years. Maybe this was his chance to balance the scales. But as he stared down the barrels of 6 guns, Samuel couldn't help but wonder if he was about to make Eleanor a widow twice over. The first shot came from the scarred bounty hunter, his impatience overruling his leader's caution. The bullet splintered the porch rail inches from Samuel's shoulder, but his own rifle was already speaking in response. The scarred man tumbled backward off his horse, clutching his chest, his scream cut short by the thunder of hoofbeats as the remaining riders scattered for cover. What followed was less a gunfight than a deadly dance, with Samuel using every piece of cover his ranch provided while the bounty hunters tried to close the distance. He dropped behind the water trough as bullets whined overhead, rolled toward the barn as return fire peppered the ground where he'd been. 23 years of isolation had kept his shooting eye sharp, and 2 more bounty hunters fell before they could find adequate shelter. But numbers were numbers, and even the best marksmen couldn't be everywhere at once. Samuel felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the dirt. He dove for the cover of an overturned wagon, his arm hanging useless, hot blood soaking his shirt. The silver-bearded leader emerged from behind the chicken coop, his pistol trained on Samuel's hiding place. "Enough!" he shouted. "Come out now, or we burn the whole place down with both of you in it." Samuel pressed his back against the wagon wheel, fighting waves of dizziness. Through the gap between the wagon bed and the ground, he could see the barn where Eleanor had taken shelter. She stood silhouetted in the doorway, still clutching her dead child, watching the battle unfold with the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. "You hear me, Hartwell?" the leader called. "Send out the woman, and maybe you live through this morning." Samuel closed his eyes, thinking of all the mornings he'd wasted, all the years spent in lonely silence when he could have been living. Martha's face came to him again, but this time she was smiling, the way she'd smiled on their wedding day when she'd promised to love him through whatever troubles might come. "Go to hell," he called back. The leader's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Have it your way." Samuel heard the scratch of a match, smelled the acrid smoke of kerosene-soaked rags. The barn would go up like a torch, and Eleanor with it. Unless. He looked down at the pistol in his good hand, counted the remaining bullets. 3 shots. 3 men left standing. The mathematics of desperation had never been so clear. Samuel Hartwell stood up. The silver-bearded leader had his back turned, focused on setting fire to the barn. The other 2 bounty hunters were reloading behind their own cover, certain that the wounded rancher was finished. None of them saw him rise from behind the wagon like an avenging ghost, his pistol steady despite the blood loss and pain. The first shot took the leader in the back, dropping him before he could turn around. The second and third shots came so quickly they sounded almost like one, and suddenly the morning was quiet except for the crackling of flames and the distant lowing of frightened cattle. Samuel swayed on his feet, the empty pistol falling from nerveless fingers. The barn was burning now, orange tongues of flame licking at the dry wood, but Eleanor was running toward him across the yard, the dead child still in her arms, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope. She reached him just as his legs gave out, catching him as he fell, both of them sinking to the blood-soaked earth. Up close, Samuel could see that her fever was worse, that the ride and the fight had opened her wounds beyond any hope of healing. They were both dying, he realized with strange calm. 2 broken people who had found each other, at the very end. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of flames. "Why did you do it?" Samuel looked into her winter sky eyes and saw Martha looking back at him, saw all the children he never held, all the love he'd kept locked away in a heart too afraid to break again. "Because," he said, his voice growing faint, "sometimes that's all we can do. Choose to be better than we were." Eleanor nodded, understanding passing between them like a secret. She shifted the dead child in her arms, and for a moment, Samuel could almost imagine the boy was simply sleeping, that love alone had been enough to bring him back from the darkness. The barn collapsed in a shower of sparks and ash, the sound like distant thunder. Samuel closed his eyes and felt Martha's hand in his, felt the weight of 23 years of silence finally lifting from his shoulders. In the end, he supposed, that was what mattered. Not the years you spent hiding from the world, but the moment you chose to step into the light. Even if that light was fire.